traditional English tea with dulce de leche, a fourth daily meal, and a giant plate of hangover food. This week, it's the British in South America.
Traveling the world to bring you delicious dishes, tasty beverages, and interesting experiences. This is the Destination Eat Drink Podcast on the Radio Misfits Podcast Network.
I'm Brent Peterson. Welcome to Destination Eat Drink, the travel podcast for foodies. Destination Eat Drink is for foodies who like to travel and travelers who love to eat. And this week, we're talking with award-winning travel writer Shafik Meghji. But first, do me a favor, rate and review Destination Eat Drink. It only takes a minute to dish out those 5 stars on your podcast app, and it helps other foodie travelers find the show. And thank you very much. And if you're planning a trip to Portugal or Spain or Malta, I've got foodie travel guide, ebooks to all those places, as well as Milan and cities in Belgium and France. They give you all the best local dishes and drinks to try and where to get them, as well as the best things to do on your trip. Download yours at buymeacoffee.com/destinationeatdrink. Well, here we are, our 351st episode. Thanks to everyone who sent the nice words about the 350th. It's quite a landmark, 350 episodes. So thanks for reaching out. Shafik Meghji is an award-winning travel writer who has written the Rough Guide books to India, Bolivia, Chile, and many, many more. I had Shafik on the podcast 2 years ago when his travel memoir Crossed Off the Map was released. His latest book, Small Earthquakes, A Journey Through Lost British History in South America, is out in the UK and will be released in the US on October 15th. Shafik and I talk about the surprisingly expansive colonialism of Britain all over South America, including Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, and more. We also talk about South American pubs, giant plates of steak and eggs, and we even get a little welcome to Wrexham talk in. And I'm starving, so let's eat.
Destination Eat Drink.
Shafik Meghji, welcome back to Destination Eat Drink. It's been far too long, my friend. I'm glad to have you back on the podcast.
Brent, I'm delighted to be back. I was just trying to chalk up how long it's been. Definitely too long.
Yeah, your new book is called Small Earthquakes, A Journey Through Lost British History in South America. And I got to tell you, Shafik, when I first got the book and I read the title, I said to myself, wait, the Brits were in South America? Because, my American-centric mind immediately thinks, well, they colonized the U.S., they colonized the Caribbean. Yeah, they were in Africa, they were in the Pacific, but I don't immediately think South America. Can you give me a little thumbnail of how the British came to be involved in South America?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're not wrong to be surprised, and I think many British people would be surprised too, because it's not a story that you read much about or that you see in popular culture or that you see kind of representation of. People in South America are much more aware of it, I should say.
I'm sure.
But it was the kind of the surprising element, and the fact that this story didn't appear to have been told, or certainly hadn't been told recently, that kind of drew me to the subject. I mean, British connections with South America date back to, half a millennia, pretty much, to the voyages of people like Magellan. There were British sailors on board, to pirates such as Sir Francis Drake, who plundered Spanish colonial settlements. But it's also a story of migration. There were lots of the tens, hundreds of thousands of British people and from Ireland who emigrated to the Americas, obviously, during this period, but not just to North America, to South America too, to Argentina, to Chile, to Uruguay, which are the focuses of my stories.
Yes.
And others went to try and make their fortunes, to launch business empires, to work as freedom fighters, to work as shepherds, as missionaries in a desperate bid to convert people. So they went. British connections take many, many forms and resulted in many, many stories, and really created like a deep shared history that I mentioned before. It kind of spans the best part of 500 years, and it continues on to this day.
You know, you mentioned all these folks that came to South America, and I wrote down a stat here: 60,000 British people arrived in Argentina between the mid-19th century and the early 20th century. Shafik, do you consider those folks, I guess this is at the tail end of the height of the Imperial British Empire, do you consider these folks colonists, immigrants? How do we classify them, would you say?
It's interesting, and obviously the people themselves would, have many varied classifications for themselves. I mean, as I said, between the mid 19th century and the mid 20th century, the age of mass migration, the great age of mass migration. We know the story in the US and Ellis Island. The bulk of people from Europe and the Middle East ended up there. Argentina was the second biggest recipient of migrants at that time. The economy was growing massively. The country was expanding territorially too. And it was also, certainly the earlier part of this period, was the high point of the British Empire as well. So Argentina, the British population, or the Anglo-Argentine population, depending on how you want to define it, at one point was the biggest in Argentina outside of the empire. Now, often these people would call themselves a colony. There's in Uruguay, for example, they would often, which was a much smaller country and a smaller immigrant population, they would class themselves as a colony. Some were just going for a few years to make their fortunes. Others were seeking the same kind of opportunities that people have migrated for throughout history. They're kind of seeking a new life, a way out of poverty, in some cases, such as the Welsh migration to Patagonia, which took place starting from 1865. It was to flee as they saw kind of cultural persecution, to protect their language, to protect their religious practices. So kind of, it's almost impossible to generalize exactly one reason why people went out, but definitely some people went out with a colonial mindset, and a lot of people in like academics, both in Britain and Argentina, have described Argentina as part of Britain's informal empire. So it wasn't technically incorporated in, but the British Navy, the British economy, dominant for much of this period, exerted a lot of pressure on these South American countries, and often British and Anglo Argentine or Anglo-Chilean or Anglo-Uruguayan companies played a disproportionate role in the local economies. Railways would be a classic example of that in all three countries.
We're like 100 years, more than 100 years removed from the height of this British immigration to Argentina. And I'm curious, as generations go on, you tend to see in a lot of communities a lessening of that influence. Can you still see British influence in Argentina, especially maybe from the generations following these immigrants?
Yeah. So no, as you say, people migrants do everywhere in the world, that they integrate and kind of in many cases lose touch with some of their roots, and so obviously in somewhere like Argentina it varies widely. There's British associations that still host events and maintain the British cemetery in Buenos Aires, for example. So there's and they have Caledonian balls, for example, for the people with Scottish heritage, and in Patagonia, in northeast Patagonia, in Chubut, the Welsh Patagonian population still very much maintains its culture and heritage and connections to the old country. Most obviously through the Welsh language, through annual cultural events called Eisteddfods. So there it's very visible and very, it's very, very rich. British more generally outside of that, it kind of depends. But once you scratch the surface, you see that, these communities are still flourishing, that still maintain some of the traditions. And obviously, although it varies from person to person, the connections are still there.
You brought up the Welsh several times here, and I got to say, when I started reading your book and I saw this, I was like, it didn't come as a complete surprise, and here's why. I watched the show Welcome to Wrexham, and I know you're a big football fan, so I'm sure you watch it as well. And there was, I think on the most recent season, they identified some Wrexham fans in Patagonia of Welsh heritage and brought them over to Wales, and they watched a football game. And it was a great, I thought, one of my favorite episodes of that whole season. So I'm wondering, did you see any of this English football enthusiasm in Patagonia, and how else did Welsh culture present itself? And from a food standpoint specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I'm pleased you touched on football or soccer, because that's a great passion of mine, and that's also a really obvious legacy of the British in South America, not least in the names of a lot of the football clubs. There's a Liverpool in Uruguay. There's an Everton in Chile. River Plate, one of the most famous clubs in Argentina. Newell's Old Boys, for example. Just a hint in their names of the heritage, because the sport was introduced to these countries by British people, often through the schools system. And the same would be, the case for rugby as well. There was also cricket that was introduced, strong connections with polo and horse racing. And yeah, as you see in Welcome to Wrexham, the Welsh identity remains strong. And obviously that's often expressed through football, and, with Wrexham's incredible, miraculous rise through the divisions over the recent seasons, and also when you see international rugby being played, you see a lot of the passion and the identity will come out. And food, very similar in that it's often one of the most vivid parts of our cultures, and it's something that people take with them. So, in Patagonia, the town of Gaiman, which was founded by the Welsh settlers, back in the 19th century, is famous for its Welsh tea rooms. And these are places that offer, very historic buildings, and they offer a copious, afternoon tea. So obviously you get literally some tea to drink with it as well, in a predominantly coffee drinking culture such as in Argentina, and you get an absolute cornucopia of baked goods. So you get some traditionally Welsh items such as bara brith, such as Welsh cakes, for example, but you also see kind of lots of Argentine connections as well. So dulce de leche features prominently in lots of the cakes, alongside homemade jams and that kind of stuff. And it's it's a must do if you visit that part of the world, and it's famous within Argentina for these for these tea rooms and for these dishes. And it's kind of a nice little route in to kind of understanding the kind of the culture. Across the Andes in Chile, you see something similar. So, Chileans famously have 4 meals, right? It's breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and onces, right? Or la once, which literally means 11 or elevenses. And it's had as it's another afternoon tea. And that's another legacy of, the British presence in the country. One of the stories, there's lots of different stories about how it originated. One of the stories is that it was in wealthy British merchants would have, Chilean staff, Chilean cooks in their houses, and they would ask for elevenses, which for non-British listeners is kind of, tea and a biscuit and a piece of cake or something like that. Had mid-morning. So the Chilean cooks working in the houses would make it for the owners of the household, and then took the ritual back with them. And often, maybe they would take leftovers with them, and they would get back a bit later in the day and would have it in the afternoon.
Awesome.
And, and fast forward, the best part of a century. And, la once is a central part of, Chilean culinary culture.
Can't go wrong with a fourth meal, I say.
The more the merrier.
I'm behind that 100%. And I love this idea of, South American treats finding their way into a tea. What about like a pub culture? Is there any remnant of that in South America from the Brits?
Yeah, so pubs are a funny thing. Pubs are a difficult thing to replicate outside of Britain and Ireland. I would say, but you definitely have sometimes modern takes on British pubs. But you also have, these would be my favorite, some of the old, bars that kind of have a pub feel in terms of the wood and the beer and the general atmosphere that are kind of hung over from the wave of British migration kind of in the late 19th and early 20th century, in Valparaiso, which is a port in central Chile, one of the most important ports in the Americas. It was known as the Jewel of the Pacific, had a very big British merchant community, very influential community. And, as they do everywhere in the world, they want to go for a drink and blow off steam. And so some of those types of bars have continued, and they have something of the pub vibe still today.
Would we get like a Newcastle, or would it be a South American beer there?
Normally it's you're more likely to get South American beers and drinks more generally. This is obviously just because it's more expensive to get,
sure,
to export British products over. But you can still, you in some places I have seen Newcastle Brown Ale for sale, Guinness, obviously from Ireland, you can still get. You do sometimes get in some of these places find some traditional British beers, and kind of in the modern day, the craft beer revolution hasn't left South America behind, and so again you can also find British drinks, British spirits there too. So yeah, you kind of got the two sides of the history there.
Do you remember a favorite, maybe industrial style South American beer and maybe a craft beer that you enjoyed while you were visiting?
The beer that is most evocative for me, I'd say, rather than the best, is Quilmes, which is the classic Argentine beer, and not necessarily the best kind of. I would say, but it's on a hot night. Whenever I see the distinctive label, it takes me back to the time that I lived in Buenos Aires, to my many trips, both for research and pleasure over the years of spending time with friends in the bars in Palermo or San Telmo or so on. So that I would have to say is probably my favorite. Because as well, like food and drink, the taste is one part of it, but
Yes.
kind of the stories and the memories and the nostalgia that they evoke too are often equally, if not more important.
I want to ask you about Uruguay because I don't know anyone who's even been to Uruguay. It's funny because every time the World Cup comes around, I'm like, oh, Uruguay's in it. Cool. I want to root for them. They're the underdog. But I don't really can't say I know much about Uruguay other than it's like right over the border from Argentina, right? I mean, it's pretty easy to get there, but I really don't know much. What can you educate me about Uruguay?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think you're alone in that, Brent. I mean, football will be one of the key things that people on the internationally might know Uruguay for. They hosted the first World Cup back in 1930, and the 2030 World Cup, the first game of it will be held in Montevideo, in the same stadium that hosted the very first tournament. Nice. Which will hopefully give it a bit of much needed publicity. But it's an incredible country. It's really easy to get to. Montevideo basically lies on the opposite side of the River Plate from Buenos Aires. And when I was living in Buenos Aires, I would regularly hop over, get the ferry over, which would take about an hour to go to the port of Colonia, UNESCO World Heritage Site. So it's obviously it's much smaller, both in population and area than either Argentina or Brazil, which is kind of wedged between. And because it's got big, noisy, brash neighbors, it often gets overlooked. It's really, really worth a visit. I spent a lot of time there because of my book. I was also over there this time last year, actually, for National Geographic Traveler to write about Montevideo. Montevideo is a really interesting, beautiful city, very manageable size, very safe, very easy to explore. And also the pampas that we really associate with Argentina, that we associate with gauchos and beef and estancias and all of that kind of stuff. The pampas also extends into Uruguay as well. So you can have all of those kind of experiences. There's lots of wonderful ranches. The beef is equally as good. Uruguayans would obviously say it was much better, of course. But you can have all of those experiences. You can see those landscapes as well. Along the coast, it has some great beaches as well. I would say it's got the, Punta del Este is the most famous of the beach resorts in Uruguay, draws a lot of predominantly, but not only South American, tourists to it. And then it's got lots of wonderfully quirky places to visit as well. One of which features heavily in the book, and that's Fray Bentos. Now, I don't know, to a North American perspective, I don't know how familiar people might be with Fray Bentos. But if you say those words to a British person of any age, really, they'll recognize the name. And essentially it was one of the most famous food brands, British food brands of the 20th century. It comes from Uruguay, essentially, and a meat packing plant on the Uruguay River, founded in the 19th century, that basically ushered in the industrialization of food production, changing the way all of us eat, and as I was saying, creating one of the most famous British food brands of the 20th century, changing the Uruguayan economy. The old meat packing plant, which, this sounds strange, is actually something of a tourist attraction and is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, even though it's slowly crumbling. That meat packing plant was the first place with electric lights in Uruguay, for example. It helped to drive the economy, and it helped to set Uruguay's economy on a path that it continues today. Agriculture, particularly cattle and grain, are still central to the economy. But if you want to visit it today, you can, and get a bit of an unexpected insight into global food history, and particularly the industrialization of food. You can go along to this sleepy town of Fray Bentos, and on the banks of the river, and you can walk around the old plant, part of which is used for like the local university, but part of which has just been kind of left to kind of crumble away. And so it's got what was at the time state of the art machinery, coolers and dials and, all kinds of, weird and wonderful items. It looks a bit like Modern Times, if anyone's familiar with
Charlie
with
Chaplin.
that. Charlie Chaplin, absolutely. If it's a lot of it is like that, and you can get to these really interesting tours, which I did when I was there. One of the mottos of the company was that they would use every part of the cow except for the moo. So, which may not necessarily build your appetite, but offers you a bit of an insight into how this, how this company developed and how it helped to shape the way we eat today by, shipping over inexpensive meat products to, working class communities, across Europe and then further afield. So it's, for anyone interested in food history and likes a bit of industrial archaeology, that's the place to go.
I'm always interested in these smaller places that are kind of wedged between two big countries. And Uruguay would be an example. You got Argentina on one side, you got Brazil on the other. And in a lot of cases, the food tends to be almost always is influenced by both of those other places because they're so big and massive and have such a huge influence regionally and even globally. Is there something in Uruguay that we could go and we could have as a meal or a dish or an ingredient that is typically Uruguayan?
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting question really, because a lot of their, particularly with Argentina, a lot of the food culture is very similar because they developed at the same time with similar migration stories. Uruguay obviously on a much smaller scale. And Montevideo and Buenos Aires, obviously both port cities as well, which impact it. So a lot of the food is very similar. You see people walking around with mate, drinking mate, far more likely to see them than with a takeaway coffee, for example.
Right.
Beef obviously features very prominently on the menus. In these annual surveys that judge which nationality eats the most beef, Uruguay is always up the top there, as is Argentina. So a lot of the dishes will be very, very similar, but you can find more distinctively Uruguayan dishes, or certainly Uruguayan takes on things. So if you're in Montevideo, you need to have a chivito, which is basically like a steak, their take on a steak sandwich, but it's a great example of the genre. It can have a multitude of different fillings with it and condiments and that kind of thing. But that would be a classic kind of Uruguayan dish to have. And also, for carnivores, you've got to check out the beef there as well. Of course, baby beef is one of the most popular Uruguayan cuts and so on. I had a fantastic example of it in the port market, which is down by the port, as you might expect, and it's built in this incredible, Victorian era structure, something that was built and at least partly shipped over from Britain during the heyday of the British community there. And today it's filled with places to eat and drink. It's a bit of a tourist trap, but sometimes tourist traps are worth going to nevertheless.
Sure. And
when I was there last time, I had a fantastic baby beef cooked just right with some sweetbreads as well. Probably the best sweetbreads I think I've ever had there.
Don't tell the Portuguese.
Well, yeah, it's, I will, I'm speaking amongst friends,
of course,
friends here, aren't I? So, yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to return to Portugal and be proved wrong.
We'll do a blind taste test, Shafik. We'll have one and
count
one.
me in.
And,
perfect.
Yeah, it'd be fun. So speaking of meat, another dish I wanted to ask you about was, and forgive my pronunciation, chorrillana. The steak strips and all that stuff. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so chorrillana is again, it's a typical dish that you find in Chile, and particularly in the port of Valparaiso, which I mentioned before, which there's a fantastic half museum, half restaurant, very, very characterful place called J. Cruz Malbrin, which is supposedly the birthplace of this dish, and it's kind of hangover food. I would say it Perfect. Is a huge plate. I mean, across Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile, the portions are huge. So prepare. But this is a huge portion of really quite simple steak strips and chips and fried eggs and all of that kind of stuff. A huge mound. Really, it's take a friend would be my advice. But yeah, if you've had a bit of a heavy night, if you've been visiting some of the very characterful bars in the old port area of Valparaiso, if you've been drinking some excellent Chilean wine from the local Casablanca Valley, for example, and you need a bit of sustenance, then yeah, it's an incredible dish. Not one to be having too often, I would say, from your arteries point of view, but yeah, if you've got an appetite and you're in town, check it out.
You know, here in Portugal, one of the things that I really love about living here is that there's sort of a migration from former colonies, you know, and one of the best things about Portugal is you've got a rich Brazilian community, and, you know, dishes have come from, like feijoada has come from Brazil to Portugal. Now Portugal has adapted it. You know, there's former African colonies that we've got communities here in Portugal. And I think it's part of the rich tapestry here, and it really adds to our life and our culture and our society here. So I'm wondering, when I think of folks who migrate to the UK, generally from colonies, I think of India and Pakistan maybe are the first two that come to my mind. Are there immigrant communities in London or in England from any of these former colonies or from South America?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a really interesting subject to discuss, because there have been people from Latin America living in Britain since the 18th century, and people visiting for shorter periods as well. The stats are probably a bit out of date. One of the frustrations is there's a lack of up to date statistics on this, but you know, hundreds of thousands of people in Britain today have, you know, Latin American heritage. Some academics have described them as one of the fastest growing ethnic groups. Obviously an incredibly diverse ethnic group, multilingual ethnic group, but one of the biggest, the fastest growing ethnic groups in the UK today. But academics have also described them as one of the most invisible, but because they're often overlooked, and kind of not as much is known about that story. I mean, that is starting to change. I'm a South Londoner. There's prominent, you know, where I used to live in Brixton and nearby in Stockwell, big Brazilian community, lots of Colombians as well. But people from across the continent are found here. You see it in restaurants. You see it in people with you know the second generation who've, you know, making strides in the arts, making strides in, you know, the world of books and so on. There's, magazines, there's carnival celebrations, as well. So it's a heritage and a group of people that are often overlooked, but there's more and more recognition, and they're becoming a more and more visible presence, particularly in London, where the bulk of British Latin Americans or Latinx British people, or, you know, there's many ways people would describe themselves. It's more and more, visible today. And there's also lots of legacies of the British connections and the British history in South America. It's, involved in, near me, there's the second biggest glass house or greenhouse in the country after the famous one at Kew Gardens, is near me in southeast London. Now rather dilapidated. It's on the heritage at risk list, but that was paid for as part of an estate of a British tycoon who made his fortune from nitrate, saltpeter, basically, which was used as fertilizer and to manufacture explosives. And that was mined from the Atacama Desert, right? One of the most inhospitable places on earth. So there's also those kind of legacies too. If you go through central London, you'll see there's statues of Simon Bolivar, for example, the great liberator of South America. And during the Wars of Independence, there were connections with Britain. Lots of British soldiers went to fight as mercenaries, as freedom fighters, seeking a payday or a sense of adventure. Many of them went to fight with Simon Bolivar and his counterparts across South America. There were British regiments, right? And Bolivar talks about their role, or talked about their role quite effusively. So there's lots and lots of connections.
Well, Shafik, it's been great catching up with you. Like I said, it's been far too long since we last spoke. So thanks for the book. Thank you for coming on to the show, and always looking forward to what you have next. Folks should follow you on social media as well as read the book, because you always have something interesting going on. Thanks again for being on the podcast. It was great.
Oh, well, it was absolutely my pleasure, Brent. Thanks for having me on. Our chats always seem to fly by. So already looking forward to the next appearance.
Okay, that's the always engaging Shafik Meghji. You can get his book, Small Earthquakes, in the UK, and it will be released in the US on October 15th. Pre-order yours now. You can find out more at shafikmeghji.com. That's ShafikMeghji.com. And I'll also have a link in the show notes. If you want more of my conversation with Shafik, members of my Substack have access to the full interview. We talk about the Falkland Islands, British railroad building prowess, and how Easter Island inspired Shafik's work. Sign up to become a member at destinationeatdrink.substack.com. Well, that's it for this week. Next week, we are in Bruges, Belgium for the best hot chocolate and getting votes by buying around. Don't miss that. Until then, there's plenty more foodie travel at destinationeatdrink.com. I just posted a story about Portuguese grocery stores and 5 things you won't find there. Read that at destinationeatdrink.com/blog. I also make videos. My latest video is from Pescara and our road trip in Italy. I try a pasta dish named for a musical instrument and a pastry filled with jam made from wine grapes. You can see that by clicking on the video tab at destinationeatdrink.com or by going to my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/@destinationeatdrink946. And be sure to check out my foodie travel guide ebooks. I've written dozens, including my giant tome about Portugal. I also just uploaded a foodie travel guide to Malta. You can see all of them at buymeacoffee.com/destinationeatdrink. Destination Eat Drink is distributed by the Radio Misfits Podcast Network and Ed Silla. Thanks, Ed. I'm Brent Peterson, and I'll see you down the road.
Join us next week for another culinary adventure on Destination Eat Drink, a presentation of the Radio Misfits Podcast Network.